You'll lose everything. He didn't whisper it. He didn't say it quietly to his lawyer. He stood up in the middle of the courtroom hallway, in front of our aunt, two clerks, and a stranger waiting for traffic court, and he said it loud enough that it echoed. "You have no idea what you're doing," my cousin Mark added. "When the judge sees the real numbers, you'll walk out with nothing." I remember how still I felt. Not shaky, not angry, just still. Because I knew something he didn't, and it wasn't about the numbers. If you've ever had someone try to intimidate you into silence, stay with me. And if you're listening from somewhere tonight, tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment. I do. I'm 32 now, but this started when my grandfather passed away 2 years ago. He didn't leave behind millions, no sprawling estate, just farmland on the outskirts of our county, a modest rental property, and a small investment account he'd managed quietly for decades. But in our family, land was never just land. It was pride, it was legacy, and it was leverage. Mark had always assumed the farm would be his. He's 5 years older than me, grew up 10 minutes down the road from Grandpa, helped with repairs, drove the tractor during summers. I lived farther away. My mom moved us after her divorce. We visited on holidays. But here's what people didn't see. When I was 11, Grandpa started teaching me bookkeeping at his kitchen table. Yellow legal pad, black pen. If you don't understand the numbers, he used to say, someone else will use them against you. Mark hated those afternoons. He'd roll his eyes and call it paperwork nonsense. He liked the physical side of things, fixing fences, feeding livestock. I liked structure. Grandpa liked that about me. When he got sick, I drove down every weekend, managed bills, sorted mail, organized receipts. Mark was there too, but less. Not because he didn't care, because he didn't want to see him weak. At least, that's what he said. The will reading was quiet, formal. The farm and rental property were placed into a shared trust between the two of us, 50-50. Mark didn't react in the room, but outside, in the parking lot, he did. "You?" he said, laughing once. "You live in an apartment. I also manage portfolios for a living." He didn't find that funny. At first, we tried to make it work. We agreed to keep the farm running, split rental income. But within months, I noticed discrepancies, late deposits, maintenance expenses that didn't match invoices, equipment repairs that seemed inflated. I didn't accuse him immediately. I asked questions. Why was the fencing contractor paid twice? He said it was in advance. For what? Future work. There was always an answer, just never documentation. One night, I logged into the shared trust account and saw a withdrawal that didn't match any listed expense. When I asked, he snapped, "You don't trust me?" It's not about trust, it's about transparency. That word, transparency. People who don't want it always react the loudest. 6 months later, he filed a petition. He claimed I was obstructing operational efficiency. Translation, I wouldn't sign off on expenditures I couldn't verify. His lawyer argued that because Mark lived locally and actively worked the land, he should have primary control. I was framed as the distant controlling co-beneficiary, the girl with spreadsheets, not the one with dirt under her nails. At mediation, he leaned across the table and said, "You're going to drag this out until there's nothing left." I stayed calm, because Grandpa's voice was louder in my memory than Mark's in that room. If you don't understand the numbers. The court hearing was scheduled for early spring, and in the weeks leading up to it, something shifted. I requested formal accounting. Mark delayed. I subpoenaed contractor invoices. One company didn't exist. When I mentioned that to him, he laughed. clerical error. But his eyes flickered. That's when I hired my own forensic accountant, quietly. I didn't tell Mark, not because I wanted to surprise him, but because I wanted to be certain. The report came back 3 days before the hearing, and it confirmed what I'd suspected. Funds had been diverted. Not massively, not dramatically, but consistently, over time. Enough to matter, enough to show pattern. I didn't sleep the night before court, not because I was scared of losing everything, but because I was realizing something heavier. This wasn't about land, it was about control, about who gets to define competence in a family. Mark thought volume equaled authority. I thought documentation did. And in that hallway, when he yelled that I'd lose everything, I understood his confidence. He thought I would back down, like I always had at family dinners when he interrupted me, like I had when he called me too analytical in front of our uncles. But this time, I wasn't 11, and I wasn't sitting at Grandpa's kitchen table. I was standing in a courthouse hallway with a folder in my bag and a report he didn't know existed. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected. No dramatic wood paneling, no raised voices, just fluorescent lighting, a worn carpet, and a judge who looked like he had already heard 3 versions of family betrayal before lunch. Mark sat 2 rows ahead of me, his shoulders squared like he was about to defend something heroic. I sat beside my attorney, a quiet woman named Rebecca, who didn't waste words. "Remember," she said softly, "we're not here to embarrass him. We're here to present facts." Facts. I nodded. But facts can still humiliate people who built their confidence on narrative. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The petition was read. Mark's lawyer argued first. He framed it carefully. "My client has dedicated years of physical labor to maintaining this property. The co-beneficiary, while financially literate, lives out of state and has repeatedly obstructed timely operational decisions." Obstructed. The word felt intentional. He described me as overly cautious, as paralyzing. He emphasized efficiency, community ties, tradition. It was almost impressive if you didn't know the numbers. When it was our turn, Rebecca stood calmly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue emotionally. She simply said, "We request the court review documented financial discrepancies over the last 18 months. She handed up a folder. Not the big one, not yet, just the surface layer. Bank statements, duplicate payments, missing invoices. The judge flipped through them slowly. Mark shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something sharp. Then came the first moment. "Mr. Lawson," the judge said, looking at Mark, "can you explain the payment to Greenfield Maintenance dated March 12th? Mark didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor, fence repair." "Is that the same repair billed on February 28th? A pause. "That was an advance." The judge's eyebrow lifted slightly. "For the same repair?" Mark cleared his throat. "Yes." Rebecca didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The judge made a note. We moved through 2 more similar examples, small amounts but consistent patterns. Mark's confidence didn't crumble, but it thinned. Then his lawyer stood again. "These are minor accounting errors, nothing suggesting malice or misappropriation." Minor. That word again. I watched Mark's jaw tighten. He glanced back at me once, like he was trying to read something in my face. I gave him nothing, because I was remembering something else. I was 15, sitting at Grandpa's kitchen table again, frustrated because my columns didn't balance. "I don't get it," I'd said. He'd leaned back in his chair. "When something's off, don't panic. It's not the number, it's the pattern." Pattern. The judge closed the thin folder Rebecca had submitted. "These discrepancies are concerning," he said, "but not yet conclusive. Mark's shoulders relaxed slightly. That's when Rebecca looked at me, just briefly, and nodded. My hands were steady when I reached into my bag. I pulled out the second folder, heavier. I passed it to her without a word. Mark noticed. His confidence faltered for half a second. Just enough. Rebecca approached the bench again. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we would like the court to review an independent forensic accounting analysis conducted last month." The room shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Mark's lawyer stood quickly. "We were not made aware of—" "It was filed yesterday," Rebecca replied. "Technically true." Mark's face lost color. The judge accepted the folder. He opened it slowly, turned one page, then another. Silence stretched across the room. Even the air felt heavier. The judge's expression didn't change much, but he stopped flipping casually. He started reading carefully. Mark swallowed. I saw it. The first real crack. After several minutes, the judge looked up. "Mr. Lawson," the judge said, looking at Mark, "can you explain the systematic diversion of funds categorized as operational expense but deposited into a secondary account?" Mark's attorney immediately objected. "We dispute the characterization." "You may," the judge said evenly, "but the transactions are documented." Mark shifted in his seat. His earlier hallway confidence felt distant now. The judge continued, "Mr. Lawson, do you maintain a secondary account connected to this trust?" There it was, the question. Mark hesitated. "Yes," he said finally, "for convenience." "For convenience," the judge repeated. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something quieter. Sadness, because this didn't have to be public. It didn't have to be like this. But he had chosen volume over transparency, over and over. The judge closed the folder. "I will review this in full before issuing a ruling. However, I strongly advise both parties to prepare for a restructuring of oversight." Restructuring. Not removal, not destruction, but change. The hearing adjourned for the day. As we stood, Mark turned toward me. The hallway from earlier felt different now, less theatrical, more exposed. "You hired an accountant," he said quietly. "Yes." "You went behind my back." "No, I went through the numbers." He didn't yell this time. He just stared at me, like he was finally realizing something, and I wasn't sure if it was about the money or about me. The hallway felt narrower after the hearing, not physically, but emotionally. Mark didn't shout this time. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He just looked at me like he was recalculating something. "You really think I was stealing from you?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud. It was lower than usual, controlled. I held his gaze. "I think you were moving money without transparency. That's not the same thing." "No," I said quietly. "It's worse." He flinched slightly at that. For a second, I saw something familiar in his face. Not arrogance, not anger. Defensiveness. The kind that comes from feeling cornered. "You have no idea what it costs to run that place," he said. "Feed, repairs, insurance." "I know exactly what it costs," I interrupted gently. "That's why I hired someone to calculate it." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "You don't trust me." That word again, trust. It had been weaponized so many times in this situation that it barely meant what it used to. "I trusted you," I said, "until the numbers stopped making sense." He shook his head. "You think because you have spreadsheets and reports, you understand the land." "No," I said. "I think because I have documentation, I understand the risk." There was a difference, and he knew it. We stood there in that hallway while people passed us. A couple arguing about traffic fines, a woman clutching divorce papers, a teenager with his mother whispering urgently beside him. Courtrooms don't just hold cases, they hold quiet fractures. "Mark embarrassed me in there," said finally. I didn't react. "I didn't. You embarrassed yourself when you stopped keeping records." His jaw tightened. "That forensic report makes it look intentional. It was consistent. That doesn't mean it was malicious." I paused. This was the part that mattered. "I don't know if it was malicious," I said honestly, "but it was concealed." He didn't deny that, and that silence said more than any explanation. I drove home afterward with a strange heaviness in my chest. Not triumph, not relief, just weight. Because I wasn't fighting an enemy. I was fighting someone I grew up with, someone who used to push me off the porch swing when we were kids and then pull me back up before Grandpa noticed. I remembered being 9 years old, sitting on the tailgate of his truck while he bragged about how he'd inherit the farm one day. "You'll probably just get money," he'd said. I'd shrugged. I didn't care then. But now I understood something. He hadn't just expected the land, he'd expected authority. And when Grandpa split it evenly, it didn't just change ownership, it challenged identity. The judge's review period lasted 2 weeks, 2 quiet, tense weeks. Mark didn't call. I didn't either. I spent that time rereading the forensic report, not looking for more wrongdoing, looking for motive. The diversions weren't flashy, no luxury purchases, no sudden lifestyle shifts. The cash had been used to cover shortfalls, operational gaps, cash flow issues. He wasn't siphoning for extravagance, he was plugging holes. But without telling me, and that mattered, because shared responsibility without shared information isn't partnership, it's control. The ruling day came faster than I expected. This time, the courtroom felt heavier. The judge didn't waste time. After reviewing the submitted financial analysis, he began, the court finds sufficient evidence of mismanagement of trust funds. Mismanagement, not theft, not fraud, but serious enough. The current oversight structure is inadequate. Mark's shoulders stiffened. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. Effective immediately, the trust will require dual authorization for all withdrawals exceeding $2,000. Dual authorization. The judge looked directly at Mark. Additionally, an independent accounting firm will conduct quarterly reviews for the next 2 years. Quarterly reviews. Transparency enforced. This is not a criminal matter at this time, but further discrepancies will be treated accordingly. The room was silent, not explosive, not dramatic, just decisive. Mark didn't look at me, not once. The hearing ended. People stood. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. As we stepped into the hallway again, the space felt different from that first day, less threatening, more clear. Mark finally spoke. "So that's it." "For now," I said. He nodded slowly. "You win." I shook my head. "This isn't about winning." He gave a hollow laugh. "It always is." "No," I said. "It's about accountability." He didn't argue, and that silence told me something had shifted. Not power, perspective. But I wasn't naive enough to think this was over, because mismanagement was one thing, intent was another, and there was still one detail in that forensic report that hadn't been addressed publicly. One transaction, one line item, that didn't fit the pattern, and I hadn't mentioned it yet.
The transaction was small, almost forgettable. $8,400, categorized as equipment lease adjustment, dated 3 days after Grandpa's funeral. It wasn't the amount that bothered me, it was the timing and the destination account. The forensic report had flagged it as inconsistent with operational cycle, which was accountant language for "this doesn't make sense." I hadn't brought it up in court, not because it wasn't relevant, but because it felt different from the rest, more personal. 3 days after we buried him, 3 days after I stood beside Mark at the graveside while he squeezed my shoulder and said, "We'll take care of it together." Together. I asked Rebecca about it after the ruling. She leaned back in her chair and studied the line item. Technically, it falls under the restructuring period before formal trust enforcement, she said. It's questionable, but not illegal. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at me more carefully. You want to know why? Yes. Rebecca folded her hands. Then you don't go back to court, you go back to conversation. Conversation. The thing that had been missing from the beginning. I called Mark 2 days later. He didn't answer. I sent one message. We need to talk, not about the ruling. He replied an hour later. Fine. We met at the farm. The barns smelled the same. Hay, oil, dust. For a moment, I was 12 again, watching Grandpa show us how to fix a broken hinge. Mark stood by the workbench. You didn't need to push it that far, he said without greeting. I didn't push, I replied. I documented. He gave a tight nod. So what now? I didn't pull out papers. I didn't accuse. I just said it. The 8,000, 3 days after the funeral. His body went still. That was operational, he said quickly. No, I said softly. It wasn't. Silence. A long one. The kind that doesn't feel defensive. It feels exposed. It was a buyout, he said finally. A buyout of what? He looked away. Of me. I frowned. I don't understand. He swallowed. There was a local investor interested in partial land rights for development. Grandpa had been negotiating quietly before he died. My chest tightened. What? He didn't want to tell you, Mark said. Why not? Because you would have fought it. Probably true, but he also didn't want to sign, Mark continued. He was hesitating. So what did you do? I convinced him not to. That surprised me. You stopped it? Yes. The barn felt smaller suddenly. The investor backed off, but he'd already advanced some preliminary funds. It got messy. And the 8,000? I paid him back, quietly. I stared at him. With trust money? He nodded once. I didn't want you to think I'd tried to sell off land behind your back. The irony hit me slowly. You diverted funds to hide that you'd protected the land? I didn't divert them for myself, he said sharply. I diverted them to undo something that shouldn't have been started. I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Understanding. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. He gave a hollow laugh. Because you already thought I was careless with money. If I told you Grandpa almost signed partial development rights, you would have lost it. Maybe I would have, but that wasn't the point. You decided what I could handle, I said quietly. He didn't deny it. I was trying to keep control, he admitted. There it was. Control. Not greed, not theft. Control. Because control was always his definition of strength, and mine had always been clarity. You yelled in that hallway, I said softly. You would lose everything. He looked at me. I thought you were trying to take it. I was trying to protect it. Another silence. Not hostile, just heavy. I didn't mean for it to become this, he said. I know. That was the truth. Neither of us had planned a courtroom. We'd just let pride escalate into paperwork. The oak fence creaked in the wind outside. I thought about Grandpa's words again. If you don't understand the numbers. This time, I understood something else. Numbers don't just show loss. They show motive. You can't keep making decisions alone, I said. I won't, he replied. You already did. Yes. The simplicity of that admission surprised me. No excuse, no deflection, just acknowledgement. And in that moment, I realized something. The judge opening that folder wasn't the real turning point. This was. The part where neither of us was trying to win anymore.
We stood in that barn longer than either of us meant to. Dust floating in thin afternoon light,
No lawyers, no raised voices. Just two people who had almost let inheritance turn into fracture. "I should have told you about the investor," Mark said finally. "Yes," I replied. "I thought if I handled it quietly, I'd prove I could manage things." "And instead," I said, "you proved you were afraid to share control." He didn't argue. He leaned against the workbench, arms folded loosely now, not defensively. "When Grandpa got sick," he said slowly, "I thought he'd name me sole beneficiary, not because I deserved more, just because I was here." "I know." "But when he split it evenly," he paused, searching for words. "It felt like he didn't trust me." There it was. The quiet humiliation he never said out loud. Grandpa hadn't doubted him. He had balanced him. "You think this was about the land," Mark continued. "It wasn't. It was about not being enough." I felt something soften in my chest. "I never wanted to replace you," I said. "I know that now." The word "now" mattered. Because before the court, before the folder, before the forensic report, we had both been defending identities, not assets. "I don't want to fight you," I said quietly. "Then don't." "That doesn't mean no accountability." "I know." And for the first time, I believed him. We walked out toward the fence line together. The land stretched quietly in front of us. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just steady. "I'll reimburse the trust personally for the $8,000. You don't have to." "I want to." That was different. Voluntary transparency. "I also want you involved in operational planning," he added. "Not just approvals, actual planning." I studied him. "You're serious?" "Yes." Not defensive. Not sarcastic. Serious. And I realized something that took me a while to articulate later. The courtroom forced structure, but conversation rebuilt trust. We formalized new procedures over the next few weeks. Joint budget reviews, quarterly forecasts, shared contractor selection. Boring things. Necessary things. The independent accounting firm conducted its first review 3 months later. Everything balanced. No discrepancies. The tension didn't vanish overnight, but it changed. At Thanksgiving, Mark didn't interrupt me when I explained new lease projections to our aunt. He listened. That small shift meant more than any court ruling. One evening, months later, I found myself alone at the farmhouse porch. The same porch swing where Grandpa used to sit. I ran my hand over the wood. The farm wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a battlefield. It was responsibility. Shared. Imperfect. But shared. I used to think strength meant standing alone with documentation and proof. Now I understand it also means setting a boundary and then staying long enough to rebuild inside it. Grandpa yelled that I would lose everything. But I didn't. I gained clarity. I gained structure. And maybe, unexpectedly, I gained a version of partnership that was earned, not assumed. The courtroom opened one folder, but the real shift happened when we opened a conversation neither of us wanted to have. If this story felt personal to you, tell me what boundary you had to set. Thank you for listening.